My name is Judith DeMaio, most of you know, and I am the Dean of the School of Architecture and Design at NYIT. And before I introduce Matt Altwicker, who will introduce our distinguished guests, I would make the following comments. Please turn off your cell phones. And second, as stated on our invitation, we are an AIA CES provider, so please make sure that you sign on the appropriate form. I never know anymore if there's one form or two forms. And those of you that are AIA members, if you don't have your number, write down your telephone number so we can get your phone number for your credits. Tonight's event is the kickoff event of this spring lecture series. The reason I trip over the word series is series sounds like it should be more regular than one and then a break. And then I am to remind you that the lectures will take place in the month of April. And I'm looking at this because it seems I've agreed with Farzana Gandhi to give a talk on India. And we're going to collaborate in a discussion, I think it will be. And Farzana will have an image selected of Fatih Pusikri. I would have probably chosen a slightly different image, but mostly we will be talking about modernism in India, Corbu, Lutyens, etc. And then on that talk is on April 11th. I better put it in my calendar. Daniel Libeskind will be discussing his work on April 6th. And Calvin Sow of Sow and McCowan Architects will be presenting their talk. I believe now it is April 30th. So we have a wonderful sort of diversified group of people speaking. I would also like to thank Jennifer Mitchell, who was upstairs signing people in, for helping to coordinate this event. And I would ask Matt Altwicker, Professor Altwicker, Chairman Altwicker of the Manhattan campus, to come up and make the introduction of our guests, Tim Love and Matthew Little. And they are here with us from Boston, took the train today, yeah. And we're delighted to have you, and the name of the talk is Housing as Urbanism. Matt, thank you.
I was trying to figure out why the dean was having me do this kind of second introduction, and I realized it's because I was actually the reason for getting Tim and Matthew here, and it's because we have a shared friend in Boston, and he had recommended a long time ago to me that I would have a kind of particular interest in their work. And what I found out in the meantime is that we have 3 or 4 faculty on our faculty on both campuses who have had Tim Love as a professor along the way. So it's pretty fascinating, his kind of connection to NYIT, even though he hasn't been here before. So Utile is a Boston-based architecture and urban design firm, solving complex issues that have to do with planning, that have to do with policy, and have to do with practical solutions. And I think that's kind of an important way to start to look at their work. They kind of split the work, at least as I understand it. Tim focuses on the relationship between individual works of architecture and the city, while Matthew looks a little bit more at building and zoning codes, the regulatory process, and in particular how they relate to urban design and housing. Obviously, it's a collaborative practice that works on both housing and urban design. And this has to do with, on one level, public participation within the process. So there's a kind of, if you go to their website, there's a kind of fantastic set of kind of documents you can download and videos you can see with the way that this process works. And also how to work together with public agencies. So it's not just about the architecture itself, but it's about the things which might influence the architecture and how it might work in the other way as well. I also, so sort of from looking around the website and reading the short statement, understand that in addition to work in Boston, there's a kind of growing number of projects that are happening in the Middle East as well. So to add to that, I would also say that both Tim and Matthew teach at Northeastern University. Tim is a tenured professor there and does a research studio focusing on contemporary market-driven building types, whereas Matthew leads a graduate-level research studio focusing on urban architectural typologies. And so that's a brief summary. I'd like to also add that both of them are graduates of master's degrees from Harvard University, like our dean. So with that, Tim and Matthew, welcome.
This is the pointer, right?
Start and I'll
Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me now? Thanks for having us. We were wondering, we wondered why we were invited. It's good to get the backstory from Matt. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, we've framed what we do with a little bit of an argument, I'd say. First of all, we're located right in downtown Boston at Downtown Crossing. We rent the 2 floors over as 7-Eleven, and those are our ribbon windows on the 2nd floor. That was actually a bank branch designed by Jurgala in 1978, reviewed by Robert Campbell, fascinating enough. So it's been vacant for 15 years, so we got a very good deal on the rent there. And we have a sidewalk level entrance to our office. And I think the important thing to understand about our practice is that all 4 principals of the firm, we're 21 people, are all refugees from Machado and Silvetti. I'll tell that story some more in a minute. And our decision, Matthew and I were the founding partners, was we were tired of traveling around chasing museum competitions, although we did win a couple. And we decided when we started the firm, really in early 2003, we're almost exactly 10 years old, to focus on a very narrow territory in Boston because of other relationships we had through projects we had at that firm. And really, this is a map that we made back in about 2006. Really, every single project that we were doing was proximate to the downtown. You can see where our office is on the map. And then planning work we were doing for the Port Authority, and then a series of residential projects we were doing right at the industrial residential boundary. And so literally everything we were doing at the time, we could walk to or take the subway one stop to. And by doing that, what happened is that we actually were able to learn very quickly exactly how projects get done in Boston, which I practiced in New York for 5 years. I was familiar with ULURP and the right zoning lawyers and that whole business. It's a very different story in Boston. It's a kind of a parallel universe, like a science fiction movie. But there are certain people that, there's both the official and the unofficial process. And we learned about that very quickly and we are now a kind of strangely, went from a scrappy startup to an establishment firm, at least with public agencies pretty quickly. We're kind of the Cooper Robertson of Boston, if that's a strange way to qualify us. And we can talk about that if you have any questions about that. So this is a diagram that we made. We were asked to be in an exhibition at RISD soon after founding the firm. And because we didn't have much built work, we made 10 large information graphics. And this is one that we made called How the World Works. It's the public along the top. You can see us and our client kind of in the swirl in the middle. Elected officials, policymakers, the code kind of coming from below. We're very interested in the full ecology of the planning and design process and have, in a way, leveraged that in Boston to be fairly impactful around very large planning decisions in the city. So what we thought we'd do today is not just talk about housing and urbanism, but we're gonna end up there, but tee up maybe the talk around something that we're very self-conscious about, which is we really think there's 2 kinds of architecture projects. One kind of project is the one of a kind. And the one-of-a-kind project, you have other lecturers coming this semester to talk about. Maybe Daniel Liebeskin is a good example. Certainly our work at Machado and Silvetti, whether for the Getty Villa or the Alston Branch Library or the many projects I was involved on there, were really meant to, as much as possible, be as unique as possible. You know, a place like no other. The other kind of project that we became familiar with early in our 10-year career were projects that are commissioned by a single client, but because it's housing or it's a particular kind of building, we aim through a kind of, through the process to also create a new type or a new paradigm, to think about individual commissions maybe as a way to tinker with type as a general strategy as a firm, and we'll talk about the difference between those two. This is a silly and maybe overly schematic, comparison between those 2 ways of thinking about an architectural commission. On the left is the Maison Domino, Corbusier's conception for a concrete frame system, maybe partly to post-rationalize some of his 1920s villas. And then somebody like Carlos Scarpa, who at the Castle Vecchio Museum leverages the little precise, fussy existing conditions to make very idiosyncratic decisions. And this, in a way, represents a kind of bandwidth of the way that architects actually practice. I said that we were all refugees from Machado and Silvetti, and I think that those one-of-a-kind projects that we did, I ran the Getty Villa project in LA for 10 years, which are the middle slides, the Alston Branch Library on the bottom right. Our partner Michael did the museum in Provincetown and the stone barns for the Rockefellers. Mimi, our other partner, did the pavilion at the Bowdoin Art Museum, and Michael did a big, huge dorm project at ASU. These were all projects that were about capitalizing on the kind of uniqueness. We just finished a very Machado Silvetti-like project at the office, a visitors pavilion for the National Park Service for the Boston Harbor Islands, which was just finished last summer, which is another kind of one of these unique projects. I'm not going to discuss this project now or its process. It's 2 open-air canopies that guide rainwater into this catch basin, made of thin shell concrete and a composite steel structure. This is a unique project, not only in terms of the client relationship and the way that the stakeholder process had to be teed up. It's also a public project. But it's also a unique, one-of-a-kind project because of the technology brought to bear to actually execute it. It was designed in Rhino, it was described geometrically in Rhino, and it was fabricated through robotic technology using the actual digital model. So these are the shop drawings from Keller they made the laser cut the ribs for the pour for the concrete, and you can see that the beams are also laser cut and requiring much more craft that we anticipated, placed within the scaffolding of the formwork so that the pins could come up into the concrete. There you see the structure before the pour happens, and then the final result. So this is, in terms of that dichotomy with the firm, the highly specialized projects that we tend to do tend to be these kind of small little urban instruments almost, and this is, again, one of our more recent examples. The other kind of project that we've been interested in, again, is our projects that can become prototypes for future projects, and this stems from our interest in different categories of practice. This is a diagram that Charles Jenks included in the Language of Postmodern Architecture that talks about different systems of architecture. And of course, system to the public has kind of withered away a little bit. It was big money back in the 70s, even in the United States. But I want to set up as an important difference system 1, which is the patronage client, whether a museum board or a wealthy family that wants to build a home, which is system number 1. And system number 3, the evil developer. So this is a little bit in terms of rhetoric skewed maybe to 1 and 2 being privileged positions, privileged strategies for doing work. But we became very interested in the third system, really also as a kind of intellectual question. And one of the things that because of all of the urban design work we've been doing, and because we do a lot of housing, that we've become interested in is the incredible robustness of market-driven building types. And I think for New York audience in particular, seeing the latest rash of rental buildings that are going up, that this is not going to be too surprising for this audience. But let's just say that the basic DNA of these market-driven building types are pretty hard to argue with. The center core office building with the 45-foot lease span, the 65-foot plus or minus double-loaded corridor residential building. Maybe you can get away with a point load if the apartments are fancier, and the hotel. And in fact, if you go hunting for these in any American city, this is Boston's Back Bay. It's like, where's Waldo, either served up straight, that's the Philip Johnson high-rise and the Robert Stern high-rise on Berkeley Street, or with some slight transformations to get these things to fit within the more idiosyncratic geometries of Boston. And in fact, even celebrated developer buildings like Aqua by Studio Gang is nothing more than Lakeshore Drive with an interesting thing around it. But the DNA of the plan is almost the same. The only difference is the incredible migrating egress stairs, which could be much closer together, which must have been very satisfying back in 1950, but with each version of the code seemed to be drifting further and further apart, like some weird, like cell mitosis in reverse. And so maybe those things will finally have to pop out of the building like the British. I don't know. And so what we ended up doing before getting big projects is actually theorizing about this. We created in the office what we call the Urbanism Starter Kit, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, a little bit useful. It was actually funded by Yale when I taught the Yale Urbanism Studio there, I guess almost 4 years ago now. And what we ended up doing was, in SketchUp and Revit, just making these things for students to use. So when I arrived at campus the first day, everybody got a disk, so they actually, it's a little bit like if Aldo Rossi worked at SOM for 20 years, was a little bit the logic. And so this was the family of types that we created in the office, but we were also able to use these then to think about and understand where the push and pull could be against what the market demands. We included in this book a kind of primer about the kind of basics about how, the kind of the general logics for these things. And what we asked in the office was, can you actually make, without deforming these types too much, can you actually make an interesting urbanism as a kind of general question for our practice, but also in a way to put building typology more firmly back into the methodology of urban design, which seems to, whether it's big firms in the city here or the chattering new urbanists around the country, seem to have taken a back seat to the urban realm. And so, a paradigm for that, I suppose, is Mises' plan for IIT, which is really at one level, at least conceptually, a collection of fairly robust building types that he invented almost whole cloth out of his head. So with that as a little bit of a background, we wanted to first talk a little bit about the master planning work that we're doing in Abu Dhabi. We did, I guess maybe Matthew, the third master plan for what used to be called Soa Island is now called Il Maria in Abu Dhabi. It's a whole new island of development that we were brought in to tinker with one more time, including making these almost fantastical images of this. We had a facade party at the office to make a complete city from scratch. But the real story here is that this is the location of this new island. It's one of several new developments that are being planned in Abu Dhabi. The plan, and a lot of the framework, of course, is already in place, especially the infrastructure. It's a 2-level city with service and parking below and public streets above. Is that we were able to create a fairly comprehensive set of development guidelines based on the knowledge we had gained about the relative flexibility of these market-driven building types. And the point here is that the building types that I was showing you before are now an international phenomenon because of real estate investment trusts and the way that the development economy happens now. And one of our goals is, as we get embedded in this process and the metrics and the logics, is to see if it, hopefully moving forward in a more radical way, we can tinker with some of these types. We're still, in a way, learning the ropes in terms of what's possible and what's not, and where the decisions makers are in the process. For example, real estate finance underwriters have a strange level of control over building types in the modern economy, and that's a whole discussion for another time. So these are some of the development guidelines we've been doing for Abu Dhabi. And then some images of maybe the city to come. We've been also working at the other scale too. We've been working on, in Minneapolis, Boston, and New Haven, Connecticut, dying industrial areas that still have vital businesses in them, but kind of as islands in post-industrial areas. And the other type that we've been focusing on by understanding the code are hybrid commercial industrial buildings and live-work buildings. This is a set of types that we developed for the Minneapolis riverfront competition with Stoss last year, which include both a high bay industrial space, the kind of bustle that runs out the back where the trucks come, and then 4 stories of loft space along the street edge. Tied to even strategies about both on private property stormwater management, but also tying into larger systems. We're now implementing this strategy as part of the Mill River District in New Haven, Connecticut. But the point here, too, is to use architecture specificity earlier in the planning process to understand more precisely, in terms of the metrics, in terms of these buildings, what very broad brush planning strategies might be. So in the case of Minneapolis, we developed a whole family of types, all hybrid buildings that combined high bay space that the market wanted for light manufacturing and combinations of loft space and office space. And we're able to envision a whole district on what are now mostly vacant parcels. To even understand the density of the urbanism we were talking about, tied to the kind of parallel infrastructure planning that happens at this scale of planning, where the stormwater system, the sewer system, the utilities, and the streets are also being analyzed. So that, in a way, the filling in of this as both real estate, people, and vision doesn't have to wait until the other kind of planning actually happens. And so we're able to, very early on, this is kind of the process stuff, understand, even at the level of the street, the scale of the urbanism we were talking about. It's a little bit instant Brooklyn, maybe, in terms of the kind of urbanism that's being proposed here. And just to finish the story, we're applying the same strategy to the Mill River in New Haven. This is just east of Worcester Square. If you're familiar with New Haven, maybe you know this area. And we've been using the same methodology, but we've been developing a wider range of building types to populate that plan as well. So at this point, I'm going to turn the talk over to Matthew, who's going to talk more specifically about our urban housing work.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Are you on? Is your thing on?
Oh, this is working. Okay. When we started our practice, I'd say almost 10 years ago exactly, we had 2 projects. One was a kind of phase 2 urban redesign of Dewey Square in Boston for the Federal Reserve Bank there. And the other was a 24-unit kind of entry-level luxury South Boston building, housing. And those 2 kinds of projects have sort of characterized our practice ever since, I think. A lot of the market-driven typologies that we're so interested in come from our knowledge about these things. They also come through a kind of urban design lens. There's a kind of parallel lens that's going on in the office that we call the inside-out lens, which I think takes place in a lot of our multifamily architectural work, where we have a particular preoccupation with unit interiors, and specifically the kind of aggregation of units, and the way that the aggregation of units is a kind of mini city building, if you will, a kind of urbanism. We've compiled a whole bunch of our work, some of it built, many plans created but not built, in what we call our Urban Housing Atlas, modeled after the very nice Housing Atlas that was published a few years ago. We typically like to think about our multifamily housing as new prototypes. The double-loaded corridor has been invented. It's been perfected and will continue to get refined with the building code. We find that a lot of the sites that are available to us, particularly with our infill work, require atypical solutions to to fill them out. This particular site is on a kind of urban industrial edge neighborhood. So there's industrial properties on one side, residential's on the other. It's a kind of a bridge zone where you might find the converted mill building, things of that nature. The lot is 150 feet by 100 feet, more or less. And it's a very awkward size, actually, for multifamily housing.
I think you have bigger plans, Matthew.
I'll get to the bigger plan.
Yeah. Your mic.
This is a view. Can you hear me now? This is a view of the
It's
kind
on.
of the
Matthew, you have to
zone.
turn your mic on. Down in there. I think it's the on button. Yeah. You're live now.
Much better. Okay. This is a view of the neighborhood that a lot of our housing has happened. You can see the kind of residential fabric here, the completely industrial, and we're sort of occupying this zone right here, several projects. These two here, you can see the courtyard building that we designed, the trolley house, which is our first project. Interestingly, you can see a project that preceded us on a nearly identically sized lot where I have to say not nearly as creative. You can see that they went for the double loaded corridor and were not able to really occupy their site very well. The building is a kind of represents a little bit of an obsession with efficiency. It consists of it's essentially split down the middle. It has 2 circulation corridors, and every unit has at least 2 exposures, either on a corner or from a courtyard to the outside. And what this also minimizes is extremely long courtyards, circulation corridors that wrap around an entire building. A courtyard type is actually very complicated. Unless you do a single loaded corridor around the middle, you've got to find out some sort of point-loaded strategy. So these are a series of 2-bedroom units, 3-bedroom units, sitting on top of a plinth of 100% parking spaces. And this is where the reality of neighborhood politics come into play, and the neighbors want to make sure that this new development isn't going to use up all the on-street parking. So it's tandem spaces crammed into a kind of a plinth, and then a kind of scrim of nice lobby. And I'll toggle back to show you where, in a sense, all the kind of money goes. And it's a way to create a slightly nicer streetscape when, in fact, you're concealing quite a bit of parking. The palette was extremely dry. Again, the idea is, what if this were a mill building that had been there, or something of that nature? Every single window type is the same. They're the largest size window we could find at a particular price point. And we deployed them around the entire building. It was very popular, and I think has been full since we built it. The same developer, who was also a builder, hired us to do a kind of similar one next door. This was, if the trolley house was version 1.0, 321 was version 2.0, where instead of sort of shortened corridors, it was all completely point-loaded, so that each unit is accessed by one of 2 stairs. And you only share your piece of stair with one other unit. And this meant that you had free, unfettered connections between the sort of courtyard space and the front. It created a kind of mini, call it a mini urbanism within the project. There are 2 smaller units at the ground level, but the parking is, again, tucked in behind this kind of base. Interestingly, if the trolley house is dry in its appearance, the 321 is a little bit more wet, specifically because the regulatory authorities wanted us to juice it up a little bit as a way to
Get approval.
Get approval and create a little excitement on the street. Another project just down the road, 557, is a kind of, again, an awkwardly shaped semi-industrial site. where we were sort of forced to create a sort of muse of sorts, a kind of traditional building type, but it's a very shallow row house, essentially, very cleverly packed in with winding stairs and living spaces above to kind of make the entire package work. Similarly, again, just down the street from there, another very shallow row house typology, 4 stories, but sort of packed from front to back with parking on the bottom and a nice bedroom on the top. This particular unit was a kind of exercise in how far you could go before reaching a kind of maximum limit in terms of means of egress and that sort of thing. In general, I think we find that with a lot of our work, we are up against the limits of what the code wants us to do, and we like that aspect of our practice. The housing as urbanism theme, I think, resonates perhaps maybe a little bit more strongly within our affordable housing work, where the sites tend to be a little bit larger and where there's a more overt mission of community building. This is a 48-unit project that we did in Chelsea, Massachusetts, which is a very poor neighbor to Boston. The city's in receivership. They have a very strong community development corporation that is essentially rebuilding the entire city, block by block. Like a lot of our other projects, the site is a kind of semi-industrial zone here. There's a sheriff's training station, there's an industrial bakery, auto body, but also a few moments of residential life there. And so the challenge in these kinds of conditions is to create a there. There is no residential context to plug into. You have to kind of make a place. It has to sort of fit, and you have to get what I call the kind of public-private balance just right, so that there's a sense of community and enclosure, but it's not completely cloistered. In basic, simple terms, the project consists of a fairly simple double-loaded corridor building, and then some, we call them 2/1 walk-ups, and I'll explain how those work in a moment. The site planning really was a kind of, one of our preoccupations was what I call sort of creating local itineraries. And in brief, what that means is finding a way to concentrate all the kind of important destinations within the project in such a way that you get maximum amount of people bumping into one another. This is a community room, this is the main door, this is the mail, this is the laundry room, counterintuitively right across from the front entry. An outdoor bench, the manager's office, the outdoor barbecue seating area, the play space, the dumpster. All of these things become part of the kind of daily life, and their proximity is what makes for a kind of healthy balance between the public and private and a kind of sense of belonging. And part of that is by activating not just the kind of back spaces that are cast as sort of nice private, semi-private spaces, but also creating that kind of activity and welcoming on the front as well. There's a kind of mini itinerary, if you will, to everything, including every unit has balconies, again, which can overlook play spaces, and there's a kind of efficient maximizing of these kinds of relationships. This is what I like to call a sort of nollie plan of the whole ground floor. And you can see in this sort of brownish color are public or non-private spaces, circulation. And then the other colors alternate, the yellow and the sort of ugly mustard color are units. The goal, in a way, I'll get back to the plans in a second, but the goal was to, along its edges, both in terms of the street edge, but also in terms of the courtyard edges, was to create as many entrances as possible to kind of activate not only the street, but also the backyards as well, where there are kind of semi-private spaces next to each unit, and then also above as well in the form of balconies. The way that these 2/1s work is that at the ground level, you have flats, mostly 2 bedrooms, sometimes 3 beds, that have a formal street entrance into a kind of living area, and then also a kind of back door next to the kitchen, which runs out to a kind of semi-private back patio area that then overlooks the sort of play area. The units above are accessed through this kind of yin-yang of shared stairs. So every unit above has an entry on the street and then another entry on the courtyard itself. So if I go upstairs, you can see, for instance, this blue unit has a stair that takes you down to the street and then a stair that takes you down to the back. And the units kind of alternate in that way.
And those are duplexes.
So these are duplexes. And once you're in your unit, then that stair that you just came up becomes your own and takes you up to your 3rd floor, where you have 2 bedrooms. This is, incidentally, one of those code things that wouldn't be allowed anymore. The distance between these stairs was at the kind of minimum at the time. That distance has been increased. We'll have to reinvent the type. But this is a kind of an example of, I think, where we as a practice take a lot of pleasure is in finding interesting, nice, creative ways of aggregating units in such a way that sort of enriches the occupancy of those spaces. And then a cross-section. And you can see there's sort of a 3D model here, where here's the ground floor unit, here's the public stairs in the brown, and then these sort of two side-by-side duplexes above each one. There was an additional kind of complication, which is that the site slopes as well. And so that break, unfortunately, never occurs in a nice, clean place. But that's for next time. And so each unit above, these are shared by 2 units, and then the ground floor units have their own sort of interior, sort of semi-private space. And these are the benches you put out front and wonder, is anyone ever going to sit in them? And in fact, they do. There's a kind of fairly lively social life that happens out in those spaces. We looked at this issue a little bit more in depth in the graduate research studio that I did at Northeastern last fall in 2011. We called it Experiments in Public Housing, and we drilled down a little bit harder on this understanding of the balance between public and private. And I had the students try to apply some sort of metric to it. So they cataloged in various public housing projects the kind of sequence of thresholds that get you from a public space, in this case, the sidewalk, all the way into your unit and what the levels were. So there's the walk, there's the court, the stair, the stoop, and they actually sort of cataloged these gradations of green and marked the point about when you entered your unit. These are a very successful project in Boston called Villa Victoria, done in the 70s, a kind of very early new urbanist in spirit, but quite successful project of sort of townhouses. This, by contrast, is a very unsuccessful project called Lenox Hamden, a classic post-war public housing point-loaded type, where there's very little threshold between the front entries. And the diagrams they created are perhaps a little bit subtle, but you can see in the Lenox Camden model, there's this sort of mini cliff that occurs right here, and that's the absence of privacy. And you can see in the Villa Victoria townhouses, there's a very nice kind of gradation, even in a kind of short span. And I think a lot of this preoccupation comes from our urban design, where we think about housing, multifamily housing, and not just affordable housing, as a kind of virtual continuation of the public realm. And we think that housing in particular as a typology, maybe more than offices, have this sort of unique quality.
So so I think in summary then, I hope you see that we, in a way, are two practices in one. We're a practice that is thinking very hard about, especially at a scale of housing production that's much more common in Boston and the near suburbs than I think it is in New York. The kind of 4 or 5 story, maxed out, high density wood frame housing, really as one kind of area of research, and now into kind of larger market driven typologies too with new work that we have. And then again, these very highly customized projects that in a way require the same level of research and the same level of careful thought before kind of leaping into the solution. So one last point, I suppose, which is back to this point again, is that one of the things that as a practice that for every kind of project that we get, we're very careful to do is to make sure that our disciplinary interests in a project fall within the same Venn as our client's interests. This is, many of you maybe have seen this diagram before. It comes out of Charles and Ray Eames' office from the early 70s. It's a diagram that shows, which one do I hit here? That one, okay. The diagram that shows the interests of the design office, and so maybe the cladding details that only architects care about are out here. The interests of the client, which are always bumpy, because especially for a client that's a committee, it's not that easy to wrestle into one shape. And then the interest of the public at large. And what's nice about this diagram is that the Eames office made a case there's still plenty of design to do in the middle of the Venn. And design really in terms of the kind of discipline's interest. That's a way to kind of prioritize maybe how we think about our projects as well. So that's it.
Thank you. Very much. Do we have any questions for our guests, please? Slow to start to ask questions. We need some questions. Any questions? Yes, please.
I was wondering, in your housing project, I forgot which one it was, the one where you were, I guess, showing the pathways of different users. To what extent do you think the parking was undermining your ability to create a sort of sense of community in terms of the fact that you have to accommodate quite a lot of parking on site? It kind of pulls the building away from the street edge. I mean, you're very careful about discussion about the public realm. It seems that that's kind of a big conflict in terms of accommodating those requirements, and the sort of sense of the edge of the street. And then I was just wondering to what extent you could imagine tucking the parking beneath the building. I know there's a huge budget issue there.
Just to be clear, that's a lot line with the state sheriff police training headquarters. That's not a street on that side.
Oh, it is.
It's a mid-block parcel line.
Okay. It's a perfect setup question for me to show off another excellent feature of this project, which is that we negotiated down the number of required parking spaces very aggressively with the city, based on real data about how these occupants own cars and blah, blah, blah. And this was the number that we got down to. What we did to, in a sense, make this space more usable, if you look at the fine print, there's actually a gate right there. This space has a kind of special pattern paving, and it's also sort of coplanar with the sidewalks. And so, in effect, this acts as a kind of play space. And so it's, in a way, it's satisfying the zoning requirement by having those parking spaces there. But in fact, it's actually a clever kind of de facto kids' play space, and the kids can ride their bikes in circles or do whatever they want out there, or they have expanded sort of activities. The parking underneath a building like this, the budgets for these kinds of buildings is about $159 a square foot. And there's a lot of mucky fill under here, a lot of money already going into the piles. It wouldn't sort of be economically feasible in this environment.
And yet, with that market rate housing, you had that plinth that you sort of tucked the parking in. So, I mean, I imagine it's obviously a big expense, but...
Chelsea is a very poor city, and South Boston is more of an emerging Brooklyn-like place for professionals to live, and so the economics are very different. Those were market rate condominiums, and still, in a way, not a subsurface parking strategy that could be supported in places like the South End and the Back Bay, where the land values are even higher. But the politics around parking and street parking and perceptions and then the advocates on the other hand who, it's a kind of public battle about the parking ratio. And I'm sure it's true in most neighborhoods in New York too.
Some other questions? While they're thinking of questions, I would ask a question, which is, when you you've talked about the plan, and I'm very interested in aggregates and how you use multiple stairs to do different things. One thing you didn't talk about, what is your attitude and approach to the exterior walls, or the sort of vocabulary of for this group of housing in this area, and materials?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's, again, a lot of it is budget derived, but all of these buildings are wood frame construction, clad in some form of hardy cementitious panel, either panels or clapboards. And I think we've done maybe everything we can possibly do with that material. We've tried to vary it more obviously, places where you use them as large shingles, places where
This is all hardy.
they're actually used as panels.
Were those metal panels or wood panels?
They're cementitious.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
it's like a
all-
kind of painted cementitious.
Even this building is all made of hardy.
What does cementitious mean?
It's a cement board. It's a waterproof cement board. It's like exterior, almost gypboard. And it's the lowest cost cladding strategy that actually holds up. And it's a little bit, there's a contextual argument too, is an important one. And you can see it in the distance in this project, that all of this wood frame work that we're doing are in older urban neighborhoods that are comprised almost entirely of wood frame triple deckers. And those houses were built sometime between 1890 and 1926. You can see them in the distance there. And now they've, because of the life cycle of these things, they're either vinyl siding or they're hardy panels too. And so if you look down the street to the houses that actually cap it, those are triple deckers. There is an idea, and not for the one that Matthew pointed out, the red one that we did, where the city wanted us to do something a little bit fancier. We always ask ourselves the question, what would Adolf Loos do if he was designing 4-story wood frame housing in Chelsea, Massachusetts? It's a kind of right as our mantra.
with hardy panels.
And we're pretty sure he would do this. How's that for an answer? That's a good one.
This project, by the way, has everything you see that's white is actually vinyl. Yep, it's exterior vinyl, and we've convinced them to, around the windows, to rather than lay them flat, which makes the facade incredibly flat. Our kind of one move that we tend to do a lot is we take that bit of trim and actually turn it vertical to the building. You don't get, the way that windows are constructed, the flatness of the materials, you don't get shadow around windows the way that we're used to in the old days, And so you've got to do things to get just the smallest amount of texture.
Go backwards some more to the scheme that was the first one you showed of this sequence.
Yep.
Because keep going. Yeah, that one. That one, the frame is even more minimal
That's right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
rotated 90
Yeah, our
degrees.
goal with this was that when you're in the units, because the frame, these were actually made like picture frames like you buy at Utrecht. They were actually all pre-made as squares with countersunk holes and just screwed onto the building. And what it does is it takes wood frame wall thickness and make it seem almost masonry-like when you're on the inside, because you don't know, when you're looking out, that it's just a wood stud wall.
That's very clever, because when you look out the window at the raking angle, you see what looks to be depth.
You see thickness.
That's right.
Exactly.
I like that.
And Matthew also pointed out too that by making every single window the same, and there's a lot of them, we were able to get a lot of windows, and they're big. They're 2.8 by
They go up almost
6'8"?
to an
6'8"?
8 or 9 foot ceiling. So they're actually even larger than they
Right.
appear.
You can see them on the inside here. You can see that they're quite nice on the inside. And then, you do what you can do. I mean, it's the opposite of the Boston Harbor Island Pavilion, where because we convinced the client to make it an open air pavilion and not a building, we suddenly had a lot of money to play with, right? And that was almost Getty Villa level in terms of what we could do. And this is literally, these are literally budgets below which you couldn't do anything. And so it's a question of restraint, taste. I mean, these two projects side by side are very interesting, which is that Matthew and I prefer the trolley house much more in terms of the aesthetics. But for many, it's served up a little bit too cold. And so the kind of expression of these things has always been a little bit of an issue.
The joke is it's so dry you need chapstick just to look at it.
Right. And so, and these are both townhouse projects, but they're also trying to, in terms of the scaling of the buildings, do other things too urbanistically. So, and it's also probably, again, I mentioned this before, but once you get out of Back Bay and downtown, you immediately go to wood frame construction. There's no intermediate thing called Queens and Brooklyn. You hit this immediately. So, this is literally a half a mile from downtown, this project. So it's not out very far from the city.
We have almost in every project, there's some investment in masonry at the ground level. What we like to use, in this case, it's just basically Chelmsford granite, big sheets of it, and then these nice side sliding garage doors, which were very difficult to install. In these later projects, I think almost exclusively use the same kind of, it's actually a concrete block product, but it's 4 inches tall instead of 8. And so it has a nicer, more brick-like proportion. And we figured out a way to use it structurally so it isn't awkward and it has a certain kind of integrity. But we find that this kind of investment in material at the sort of ground level where it counts gives the project a little bit more durability, a little bit more robustness.
I have one more question. Can you go to the plan of the trolley house? This is a very strange question and very specific. Why did you choose you have the exit stair up there is a switchback. Why did you choose to make a stair that had, I read that as a void in the middle?
Yeah, this is coming off, it's an excellent question. This is coming off the lobby. So there's a rise in topography. So at the back of the garage, you're half a level into the earth. So the way you come into the building is actually 2 addresses. That's where you park your bikes and your strollers in the middle. Those are the 2 side sliding barn doors to get into the parking garage. So you go in that stair, and it immediately, whoops, I'm going the wrong way. I've ruined my little story here. It immediately curls around and becomes almost a kind of pre-war stair with a skylight on it. That's the front stair, and that really is the fire stair on the back.
That's the kind of back stair.
So go back to the plan, the parking lot. Where would that stair be above that?
It comes up and it hangs out over the parking, and then it's
Right.
It wraps around.
But the void itself comes all the way into the lobby. And then you see the egress stair ears. The parking was so tight that there's a transfer at the courtyard level to avoid parking spaces. So the stair is inboard, and it was so contentious. We had to get 2 spaces per unit, or the neighborhood was going to, throw us out. So that stair becomes these weird ears that step beyond the thing. So,
That's really interesting. Thank you. Fascinating that. I've been thinking about that stair for a while.
good. We're into that
Do
stair.
we have other questions? Yes, please.
Yeah, can you talk about the heating and cooling and the energy code for both market rate and
Well, in Boston now, we have a stretch code, and it's all pretty high. I'd say that we have a kind of standard new best practice, which gets us, I don't know if you're familiar with like Energy Star rating or HERS rating, but we are usually somewhere south of 60. And for all of you, that means that your energy use is 60% of what a kind of standard new minimal code building is. The affordable projects tend to actually even do a little better. And that's because the funding sources that come from all over the place come with all kinds of requirements. These projects are eligible for a lot of different kinds of money that go directly into energy efficiency. So this,
air or radiant?
oh, this one is air. There are heating, cooling, air units in each unit. And so there's a central boiler for heat, and then there are 48 individual condensers for cooling. So tenants pay for their cooling loads, but not their heating loads with their electricity bill. These other projects have central, similar kinds of systems, basically. But the condos obviously have their own boiler in the unit. And we've used very small units, instant hot water type units that heat the unit and the hot water, and then the air conditioning is handled separately.
Let's take two more questions. We've had a lot of faculty asking questions here and not any students. Yes, bravo, please.
So you were saying in the
Put
beginning.
it-
Is it not on?
Is it on?
I don't see what the on button is.
He's lost interest.
You were saying earlier that you find yourself fighting the code a lot, going to the minimum.
Yeah, I mean,
Is that because you feel that the people writing the code don't necessarily?
I think fighting the code isn't the right spirit. We like to find territory for innovation right at the boundaries of code, because it's usually at the point where you can maximize density under a less expensive construction type before you bump into either the high-rise code or steel and concrete. So we like to be at the outer limit of density for wood frame construction, which nobody really wrote the wood frame code for, where there's much more territory for innovation than once you get to steel and concrete and high-rise, where it's gonna all snap back to the double-loaded corridor. So like all these weird point load things we've tried in the courtyard, it's precisely because we're pushing wood frame code, type 5 and 5A, as far as we can, and finding very interesting loopholes and strange things that you can do that nobody imagined. And it makes us, I would say, we're often finding conflicts. For example, you can't have stoops anymore for buildings over a certain number of units in Massachusetts because of the Massachusetts Accessibility Code, but it's still written in design guidelines of certain municipalities. So we tend to find ourselves at these very complex places with our projects.
What I would add to that is that we don't go looking for these problems, but we tend to, when you try to reinvent a multifamily housing, concept, you end up stumbling on these things more than if you do more conventional building types.
I mean, a good case in point is that these townhouses that we designed have a single means of egress out of them. But it's because if you follow, we don't have the plans here, but if you go in the front door, up the stairs, double back, and track the egress path all the way up to the bedroom on the top, where that wall is for the upper floor is precisely here, because if it was an inch over this way, we'd have to have 2 stairs in this thing. So its section, and at the depth of that house, to get it to be a 3.5-story house, controlled where the stair was, where the circulation was, and how big the terrace was. And then once we understood that, we were able to leverage that to actually make a very nice house. So, until we got into this and realized that it's ridiculous to have 2 means of egress from a single row house, we didn't know what we could do with it. And so once you know early, and then you know how to game it for creative ends.
That's a great answer. Any other questions? Yes.
I have a design-based question. What was your process like? Because when it comes to housing, it tends to be repetitive. There's certain language that is evident. So was there like a conceptual drive behind your designs?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a good question. I mean, we are interested in the deep DNA of the plan and section of the housing first. And so it starts out being a problem about figuring out where the semi-public circulation armature is and how units aggregate around it as both a design and a social question. The language of the buildings ends up, we have this saying in the office, put off design with a capital D as long as possible. Because we worked at Machado Silvetti, just coming out of we want to do, and so we practice a kind of a mantra of research and restraint and putting that off as long as possible until we can't help it anymore. And so, even with this project, the facades are, if I do say so myself, quite sophisticated and rich, right? But we didn't want to do that until we knew where the bathrooms were and the bedrooms were. And I say we're very plan and section focused first, but as a design question, not just in terms of kind of real estate and planning. I don't know if that answers your question or not. We believe in the old, in this world of Rhino and SketchUp, we still believe very much in the virtue and power of the plan and the section.
Well, that's a wonderful note to end on. Remember that forever. That's great, really. Because the plan and the section are the essence. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Yeah.
And ask questions about